My daughter was the only one who called me on the drive to the airport, not to say goodbye, just to say, "Dad, I know why you're leaving, and I think you're right." I didn't cry until I hung up. I was 63 years old, standing at the departures terminal at Pearson with one checked bag and a carry-on, and the only person who understood me was a 28-year-old woman calling from her car on her lunch break. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. You think by the time you're in your 60s, the people who matter will finally know who you are. You think all those years of showing up to the hockey rinks at 6 in the morning, to the school plays, to the dinners you didn't want to attend, you think all of that adds up into something, a relationship, an understanding, a family that sees you clearly. I was wrong about that. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 31 years building a contracting business from nothing. Started it in my late 20s with a second-hand truck and a line of credit I could barely sleep at night thinking about. By the time I was in my mid-50s, we had 40 employees, projects across southern Ontario, a reputation that took 2 decades to earn. My wife, we were married for 27 years, used to joke that I loved the company more than I loved her. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she wasn't entirely right either. What she didn't say, what neither of us ever said out loud, was that the marriage had been hollow for a long time before it ended. Not dramatic, not explosive, just hollow. We were 2 people living parallel lives in a house that was worth considerably more than our relationship. She had her book club, her friends, her sister she talked to every single day. I had the business. We were polite to each other. We had dinner together most nights. We said, "I love you" out of habit, the way you say, "have a good one" to a cashier. Our son was 32 when things finally fell apart. Our daughter was 28. The 2 of them couldn't have been more different if we'd raised them in separate countries. My son, and I'll just call him that, my son, because the name doesn't matter, and I'm not interested in airing everything here, had always been the one who sided with his mother. Not in a cruel way, not at first, just in the way that some children are built more like one parent than the other. He had her pragmatism, her comfort with appearances, her belief that the right car in the driveway said something meaningful about a person's worth. He joined the company 6 years before everything collapsed, and within 2 years he was already pushing ideas that made me uneasy. Bigger projects, more debt, investors I didn't know, moving fast in ways that felt reckless to someone who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how fast to move. My daughter, she worked in social work in Hamilton. She drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic, and she didn't apologize for it. She called me every Sunday. She was the one who noticed things. The way her mother had started going out more, the way certain conversations at family dinners had a texture to them, a careful quality, like everyone was speaking just slightly around something they weren't saying. She noticed before I did. I found out about my wife's affair the way these things usually happen. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small things that stopped adding up. A name mentioned once too often. A change in her phone habits. A weekend trip to visit her sister. That, when I mentioned it to her sister over Christmas, her sister had never heard about. I didn't confront her right away. That's not my nature. I sat with it for about 6 weeks, going over and over the evidence in my head, the way you go over a building plan, looking for the flaw that'll cost you later. And when I finally said something, when I finally sat across from her at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night in February and said her name and then said nothing else, just waited, she didn't deny it. She was calm, calmer than I was. She said the marriage hadn't been working for years, and that was true. She said she hadn't planned for this to happen, and I believe that was probably also true. She said the man was someone she'd met through a mutual friend, a chartered accountant from Oakville, divorced, 2 grown kids. She said she was sorry. I went to the office that night. I slept on the couch in my own building 3 nights in a row before I could bring myself to go home and start the conversation about what came next. The divorce took almost a year. We were civil. Genuinely civil, not perform civil. The house sold for $1.4 million. This was Mississauga. 4 bedrooms, good school district, backs onto a ravine. We split it. I took a condo in the West End. She moved into a place near her sister. We divided things without much screaming. I think we were both, in our own ways, relieved. What I was not prepared for was my son. He knew about the affair before I did. He'd known for months. His mother had told him and he'd kept it from me, which I might have been able to understand. Family loyalty, not wanting to be in the middle of it. What I couldn't understand, what I still have trouble putting language around, was what he said to me 6 weeks after the separation was finalized. We were at the company. He'd asked to meet in my office, which he'd never done before. He sat across from my desk, the same desk I'd had for 20 years, a beat-up oak thing I'd bought used from an office liquidation sale, and he told me he'd been talking to some investors, a private equity group out of Toronto. He said the company needed new leadership to grow. He said I'd been too conservative for the market. He said these words carefully, looking just slightly past me rather than at me, the way people do when they've rehearsed something. Then he said, the investors are more comfortable with me at the helm. You'd stay on in an advisory capacity. It would be a graceful transition. I was 62 years old, and my son was telling me to step aside from the company I'd built before he was born. I asked him one question. I said, "Did your mother know about this before I did?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I drove home that night, and I sat in my condo and I thought for a long time. Not about what to do. I knew what I was going to do. I thought about how I had gotten here. How 31 years of building something, of showing up before anyone else, of signing checks when the account was nearly empty, of putting my name on the line over and over again, how all of that had led me to a conversation where my son sat across from my own desk and looked past my shoulder while he told me I was no longer needed. I thought about what my daughter had said to me the month before. We'd been having coffee at a place in Hamilton near her office, and she'd said, quietly, "Dad, I think you've been managing everyone else's comfort for so long that you don't even know what you actually want anymore." She was right. She was completely right. I sold my shares in the company. My lawyer made sure it was fair. It took 4 months, and there were some difficult conversations, but I walked away with enough that I didn't need to worry. I put most of it in a combination of GICs and dividend funds that my financial advisor, a woman I'd worked with for years and trusted completely, put together for me. I kept enough liquid for whatever came next. I want to be honest about one thing. I didn't know what came next. I had a condo in Mississauga. I had 2 children, one of whom had essentially helped push me out of my own life's work. I had no wife. I had no company. I had a handful of friendships that had always lived in the margins of a schedule built around work, and now the schedule was gone, and I realized I didn't actually know those friends as well as I'd thought. My daughter came over for dinner one night in early spring. She brought wine. I made the only thing I'd ever been able to cook reliably, which was a beef stew my mother used to make when I was small, with the turnip and the barley and the way it fills the whole apartment with something that smells like someone taking care of you. We ate, and she looked at me across the table and she said, "What do you actually want, Dad? Not what makes sense, not what's responsible. What do you want?" I said, "I want to go somewhere no one knows who I am." She laughed. Then she said, "So go." I had been to Portugal once, years ago, a long weekend in Lisbon with a work group, and the city had stayed with me in a way I hadn't quite been able to articulate. The light there is different. The way the city is built on its hills, the sound of it, the slowness, not laziness, something else, something more deliberate. I'd thought about it occasionally over the years, the way you think about a song you can't quite remember all the words to. I booked a flight in April, one way because the return date felt like a lie I didn't want to tell myself. I found a furnished apartment in the Mararia neighborhood, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that was older than Canada itself. The rent was just over €1,200 a month, which, with the exchange rate and the cost of living, felt like being handed something back after a long time of paying. I want to pause here and say something about what it actually feels like to leave. People romanticize it. The clean break, the fresh start. What they don't tell you is that the week before you leave, you go through every drawer in your condo and make decisions about objects that have been with you for decades. You find things you'd forgotten you owned. You hold a coffee mug from a trade show in 2009, and you stand there for a full minute trying to decide whether it means anything. You donate 3 carloads to Goodwill. You cancel subscriptions. You redirect your mail. You call people to say you're going, and some of them seem genuinely surprised, like they'd assumed your life would continue on its track indefinitely. My son called the day before I left, not to wish me well. He called to ask about a piece of equipment that was in my name that I'd apparently forgotten to transfer. We talked for 4 minutes. When we hung up, I felt the specific sadness of someone who has finally stopped expecting something. My daughter came to the airport. We stood in the departures area, and she hugged me for a long time, and then she pulled back and looked at me and said, "You look lighter already." I said, "I haven't left yet." She said, "I know. Lisbon in May is extraordinary. I won't pretend the first few weeks weren't strange. I'm Canadian, which means I apologize instinctively. I queue patiently. I feel vaguely guilty about doing nothing. The Portuguese have a concept, I learned the word for it slowly, imperfectly. This feeling of melancholy for things that have passed, but a melancholy that's almost sweet rather than bitter. It's built into the music, the food, the way people sit in cafes for 2 hours over a single coffee without feeling that they're wasting something. I began to understand it. I took Portuguese lessons 3 mornings a week at a small school near the city centre. I was the oldest student in my class by about 15 years, and the worst student by a significant margin. And it was the first time in decades I'd been genuinely bad at something without it mattering at all. My teacher, a patient woman who'd clearly taught people like me before, told me once that I had the vocabulary of a curious child and the grammar of a small disaster. I laughed harder at that than I'd laughed at anything in years. I walked for hours every day. The hills of Lisbon will do something to you physically. It's not a flat city, and by the end of the first month, my legs were different, and I was sleeping the way I hadn't slept since I was 30. I found a cafe near the Tagus where I started going most mornings, where the man behind the counter eventually began having my order ready when he saw me come in. There's a particular kindness in being recognized by a stranger in a country that isn't yours. It's its own small dignity. I called my daughter every Sunday. She told me about her work, her friends, a man she was seeing who sounded steady and kind. I told her about the city, the people in my language class, the fact that I'd started cooking properly for the first time in my adult life, real cooking, with a market down the street where I went 3 times a week and pointed at things I didn't know the names of yet and tried to figure out what to do with them when I got home. I didn't think about my ex-wife very often. That sounds like something people say and don't mean, but I mean it. The grief, and there was grief, not for the affair or the end of the marriage exactly, but for the version of the life I'd thought I was living. The grief had done most of its work during the year of the divorce and the months of the business dissolution. By the time I was sitting on my small terrace in Mararia, watching the sun go down over the rooftops, it was mostly gone. What was left was quieter. A kind of accounting. Things I'd done well. Things I hadn't. Neither list was particularly surprising. My son called me in September, 5 months after I'd left. I was in the kitchen. It was early evening. I'd just gotten back from the market. I was trying to figure out what to do with a bag of dried salt cod that I'd bought on impulse. I saw his name on the screen and I stood there for a moment. Then I answered. He said, "Dad." I said, "Hello." There was a pause, the kind that has weight to it. He told me the investors had brought in a new operations director, someone from outside, someone who had immediately started changing the way bids were structured, the way contracts were managed, the relationships with suppliers that I had spent years, in some cases decades, building. He told me that 3 of our longest-standing project managers had quit in the past 2 months. He told me they'd lost a major municipal contract in Brampton, a contract I'd cultivated for 4 years, because the new director had submitted a bid that was, in his words, not realistic. He said, "I think I made a mistake." I sat down at the kitchen table. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not satisfaction. It was not vindication, not in any clean way. It was something more complicated. A sadness that things had gone the way I'd known they would, and under that, something older and more stubborn. The part of me that had spent 30 years caring about that company, about the people who worked there, about the work itself. That part ached. I said, "I know." He said, "Is there anything?" and then he stopped. I said, "There isn't. I signed everything over. It's not my company anymore." He was quiet. I said, "What are you going to do?" He said he didn't know. He said the investors were already talking about restructuring. That word in business almost always means something painful is coming for people who don't deserve it. We talked for about 20 minutes, not warmly, but honestly. That was something, at least. At the end he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. About the company. About everything." I said, "I know you are." I didn't say I forgave him because I wasn't sure yet if I did. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't something you can perform. You either arrive there or you don't, and you can't rush the trip. When I hung up, I stood at the window for a while. The Tagus was visible from a certain angle if you leaned a bit to the right and looked between 2 buildings. The river was silver in the evening light. A ferry was crossing. People on their way home from work. My ex-wife called 6 weeks later. I was more surprised by this one. It was a Sunday morning. I'd just come back from my Portuguese lesson. We'd moved to Sunday mornings by then. A smaller group, more conversational. I was making coffee. I saw her name, and I stayed very still for a moment, the way you stay still when something unexpected moves through a space. I answered. She said she'd heard I was living in Portugal. I said yes. She said she'd heard it through our daughter, which meant our daughter had told her, which I found I didn't mind. She said she was calling because, and here she paused, and I recognized the pause. It was the pause she'd always used before saying something difficult. She said she was calling because she thought she owed me an apology, not for the affair specifically, or not only for that, but for something she'd said once that she'd been thinking about. Years ago, during an argument that had seemed minor at the time, she'd said that I was a man who was easier to respect than to love. She said she'd been wrong about that. She said she'd understood it too late. She said the man she'd married so quickly after our divorce, she said it wasn't working the way she'd thought it would. She wasn't asking for anything. She wanted to say the thing. I stood in my kitchen in Lisbon with the coffee going and the window open and the sound of the city below, and I listened to my ex-wife tell me she'd been wrong about me. I said, "Thank you for saying that." She asked how I was. I said, "Better than I've been in years." She said she was glad. We talked for a little while longer, carefully, without pretense, which was new. When we said goodbye, there wasn't anything left unfinished. Not resolved, not healed, but finished, like a door that had been standing half open for a long time had finally gently closed. My daughter called that afternoon. I told her about the conversation. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like I actually live here now." She understood what I meant. My daughter usually does. I've been in Lisbon for 14 months. My Portuguese is still a small disaster, though improving. I know the name of the man who sells vegetables at the Tuesday market, and he knows mine. I've started doing some consulting work. Small things, nothing like before, for a Canadian-owned construction company operating in the Algarve. Enough to keep the mind sharp. Not enough to become my life again. I think about the version of myself that sat in that condo in Mississauga 2 years ago and held a coffee mug from a 2009 trade show and couldn't decide whether it meant anything. That man was so tired, he'd been managing everyone else's expectations for so long that he'd lost track of his own. He needed someone to tell him to go. My daughter told him. I keep a photo she sent me. Her on a hiking trail somewhere in the Niagara Escarpment, laughing at something off camera, her hair in the wind. I have it on the small table by the window where I have my coffee in the mornings. There's a thing I've learned here. Living among people who've had centuries of practice at it, dignity is not something you lose when you walk away. Sometimes it's the only thing you take with you, and it turns out to be enough. More than enough. There's something I've been thinking about since that phone call from my son, the one that came on a Tuesday evening in September, while I was standing in a Lisbon kitchen trying to figure out what to do with salt cod. What strikes me most isn't that things went badly for the company after I left. I knew they would, not because I'm exceptional, but because I'd spent 31 years learning things that can't be summarized in a pitch deck or transferred in a handshake with a private equity group. There are things you only know after you've signed a check on a Friday when you weren't sure it would clear, after you've stood on a job site in January in southern Ontario and made a call that cost you money in the short run and saved a relationship that was worth 10 times that 5 years later. That kind of knowing lives in the body. It doesn't show up on an org chart. What I keep coming back to is this. My son is not a bad person. I want to say that clearly. He made choices driven by ambition and by a belief that newer and faster is always better. And the world does a very good job of telling young people that's true. But ambition without honesty is just speed without steering. You move fast and you feel like you're winning right up until the moment you realize you've been heading in the wrong direction the whole time. I think about the choices I made after the separation. I could have fought harder for the company. I had grounds. My lawyer said so more than once. But I looked at what that fight would cost. Not in money, in time, in the quality of whatever years I have left. And I decided it wasn't worth it. That decision came from somewhere I'd worked hard to get to, a place where I knew the difference between what I was owed and what I actually needed. That's not something you arrive at easily. It takes a long time of being honest with yourself, about your failures, your blind spots, the ways you showed up and the ways you didn't. I wasn't a perfect husband. I wasn't always a present father. I gave the company things I should have given my family. I know that. The accounting has to include all of it, not just the parts that make you look good. What I've learned, and I mean learned in the way that actually changes how you live, not just something you say, is that the people who come through hard things with their decency intact are the ones who never stopped being honest even when dishonesty would have been easier. My daughter understood that. She saw it in me before I saw it in myself, and she told me to go. That took its own kind of courage from her. And then there's the simple matter of not quitting, not on yourself. Packing one bag and getting on a plane at 63 years old because you've decided you're not finished yet. That's not dramatic. It's just a refusal to accept that the story is over. The hills in Lisbon are steep. My legs are stronger than they've been in 20 years. Some mornings that feels like enough of a metaphor. I hope my son finds his way to the kind of clarity that only comes from sitting with something you got wrong. It's not comfortable, but it's the only thing that actually teaches you anything. I'm having coffee by the window. The city is waking up outside. I'm not waiting for anything. That, it turns out, is exactly what peace feels like.